The Darius Cozmic Collection was an amazing compilation of games from the Darius series, but there was one extremely notable omission. That was, of course, Taito's first 3D title in the Darius series, G-Darius. Now, with Darius Cozmic Revelation, G-Darius can finally have its time to shine on modern systems while also being joined by Dariusburst and, for some lucky players in the West, Gameboy Sagaia. Before we dive into the individual games, I wanted to first take a look at Cozmic Revelation's presentation overall. Now, as far as the Japanese physical release goes, it's nothing particularly special, although this time there is indeed inside cover art, something that was lacking in the Cozmic Collection's physical release. However, what really stuck out to me was the way that the games are presented, at least on the Switch port. The way that the original Cozmic Collection was laid out made sense to me. You launch the game from the Switch's main menu and you're given a little scrolling menu inside of the game to choose which Darius title you want to play. I mean, it makes sense, right? That's not how Cozmic Revelation works. No, instead, G-Darius and Dariusburst, while both on the same cartridge, are, for whatever reason, recognized as two separate game files. I've never seen this before and it's really baffling. Because of this, they don't share any common menu layouts or anything, so I'm just gonna have to treat them as entirely different games for the purposes of this video. So with that being said, let's start off with G-Darius HD. The layout has totally changed since the Cozmic Collection. G-Darius HD starts you off with a simple menu allowing you to choose between the original game or the HD remaster. Both of them play pretty much the same, but the HD remaster is truly a sight to behold. It keeps the low poly aesthetic of the original, but updates the resolution entirely. This gives us a gorgeous, crisp, blocky ass game, and I am all about this. In my standalone video for G-Darius, I mentioned that I don't typically enjoy early 3D models, but that I really did like the graphics in G-Darius, because this blockiness kind of adds to the sensation of our marine foes being evil mecha fish. But the only real way to understand how gorgeous the updated graphics are is to give you a couple of side-by-side comparisons. As you can see, not much has changed outside of just the resolution of the game. I love how the elements that are made up of sprites still have the same resolution and look pixelated and blocky. The aesthetic of G-Darius HD could have easily come off as a lazy excuse for a remaster, but the style that it pulls off is absolutely astounding, and instead, it comes off as a clear artistic choice. Aside from the updated graphics, we also get achievements we can unlock by completing simple tasks throughout the game, such as capturing enemies and mid-bosses and beating certain stages. We also get access to a Pokemon-like gotta catch 'em all list of enemies and mid-bosses that we need to capture in order to fill out some of the achievements. I love how each enemy has its location noted in its data, as well as what it does when you capture it. And of course, online leaderboards are back, so you can compete with players all around the world for the highest score. And along with it comes the ability to create save states so that we can practice certain levels and bosses, and let me tell you, you're gonna need them. G-Darius is one of the most brutally difficult games in the Darius series, but getting that 1cc is not impossible. 1cc! After making a couple of save states to practice certain bosses and levels that were giving me trouble and plotting a route that worked best for me, I indeed was able to get that true 1 credit clear and earn my right to critique G-Darius. If you're unfamiliar with G-Darius, it was released a couple of years after Darius Gaiden and borrows several small mechanics from that game and turns them into the entire meta. What I mean is, in Darius Gaiden, you could capture the mid-bosses of each level. In G-Darius, you can capture almost any enemy in the game. In Darius Gaiden, one of those mid-bosses could pull off a special move by inputting a Street Fighter-like input. In G-Darius, every mid-boss has a special move that can be used when captured. And in Darius Gaiden, there was one level that was made up entirely of a giant boss fight. In G-Darius, there are several. However, don't think that G-Darius is just a modified version of Darius Gaiden because it plays almost entirely differently. First of all, the power-ups are completely different and much more like how they were in the first Darius game, where you start off with the missiles, upgrade to the laser, and end with the wave, while if you die, you get reset to the base level of whatever weapon type you had. For example, if you die while you have the laser, then you'll get reset to the base laser power-up. And the biggest thing that separates it from other games is that you can take your captured enemies and convert them into either a bomb to give you iframes and destroy enemies, or into an alpha laser that does a ton of damage and allows you to engage in these wild Dragon Ball-like laser battles with the bosses. While G-Darius may not have as many overall stages as previous games in the series, each stage does have its own branching path, meaning that there are always two different ways to go through the same stage, and each path will bring you to a slightly different variation of the final boss. Learning which stages are easier for you and which boss patterns you can memorize is key to making your way through G-Darius. Different paths will offer a different number of upgrades and a different type of challenge, so you have to keep track of which routes get you upgraded quickest and which routes are the easiest to get through. While it is incredibly fun, I think G-Darius is not a good game for beginners. While Cosmic Revelation does provide the player with multiple different difficulties, some levels will stuff your turkey back and forth before you can even figure out what's going on. For this reason, I highly encourage the use of save states. Cosmic Revelation has 16 different save states that can be used at once, so make sure to create one for any of the bosses or stages that are giving you extra difficulty so that you can practice them without having to go through the first few stages over and over and over again like I had to do back on the PlayStation 1 version. One interesting note is that G-Darius and G-Darius HD suffer from some slowdown, at least on the Switch port. While you could say that this is a bad thing, I wouldn't. Honestly, the slowdown is much appreciated and can help you out on some particularly tricky parts. I never found that the slowdown would get in the way or mess up the pace of the game, and always found it to be a godsend on those later levels, but I know some people won't like it. Once again, gadgets return from the Cozmic Collection. However, one notable one that's missing is the boss health bar. This was an awesome feature added to the Cozmic Collection through an update down the line, and I was disappointed not to see it here for G-Darius, especially since I'm quite unfamiliar with a lot of the bosses in this game. There's also no way to look at your rank, which was another really helpful gadget in the Cozmic Collection. Maybe they'll be added in a future update, but for now it's quite unfortunate that they aren't here. The music in G-Darius is unparalleled and is absolutely bizarre and amazing. I particularly like that the game starts off without any music until you get halfway through the first zone. It creates this weird and unsettling atmosphere that continues to shine throughout the rest of the soundtrack. The music is almost entirely original compositions, with the exception of the end theme, which takes its melody from one of the boss tracks of Gameboy Sagaia, but we'll get to that a little later. I would say G-Darius HD is probably the best version of G-Darius to be released, simply due to the updated graphics, save states, online leaderboards, achievements, and bestiary included in the package, not to mention fully customizable controls and a multitude of screen sizes to choose from. However, the lack of certain gadgets and the absolutely brutal difficulty can make it difficult for new players to enjoy. I found myself getting quite frustrated when I was first starting out, and even a couple dozen hours into learning the game. But thanks to save states, it's much easier to figure out the game, and once you do that, it becomes an absolute blast. I can really see why some people say G-Darius is their favorite in the series, though to me, I'd pick Darius Gaiden over G-Darius any day. And for some reason, they took away the ability to save your replays. The only way that you can watch a replay now is if it gets saved as your high score. Why would they take away the ability to save multiple replays from us? If you want a more in-depth analysis on my thoughts about G-Darius, I've got an entire video dedicated to just that. But for now, let's switch gears and take a look at Dariusburst, another Chronicle EX+. The history of Dariusburst and its multitude of ports and revisions is far beyond the scope of this video, so for now, I'm going to treat this as simply a port of the arcade version, and sometime later down the line I'll take a look at the expansive history of this game. Now, for better and for worse, this is pretty much a straight port of the arcade game, but with a couple of added features. If you're unfamiliar with how Dariusburst plays compared to other games in the series, then, just like I did, you may not enjoy it. At first. First of all, Dariusburst throws a lot of information at the player without a coherent explanation for any of it. You've got like 10 ships to choose from, 4 different game modes, each of which has sub-game modes, and on top of that, you can even choose a numbered cabinet, so what the heck does any of this even mean? If you're playing this game for the first time, the first thing you'll see is the title screen, which tells you to press start. And upon hitting the plus button on Switch, the pause menu comes up. The unlock B message might make you think you should press B, but the B button doesn't do anything either. Underneath the actual game screen, there's a little UI message that tells us that X is the start button for whatever reason. Then, when we actually get into the game, we're given 4 different game modes to choose from, and a timer forcing us to decide between which mode we want to play. But why? This is a home console port, not an arcade. Why are they enforcing a time limit on us? Anyway, if we stick with original mode, then we're prompted to choose between default entry or infinite ships entry. So this means we either have to 1cc the game or just credit feed. Well, after losing in default, we're presented with the option to just continue anyway. So what's the point of having both of these modes if they're just the same thing? This is my long way of saying the UI in Dariusburst isn't very well thought out. It's clunky, it's redundant, and it's confusing for first-time players. What you really want to do is stick with original mode while you learn how the game works. The original Dariusburst only had 3 ships to choose from, and they were all unlocked sequentially, giving the player time to learn each ship without having an overwhelming amount of choice thrust upon them. I generally find this to be a much better way to present a game. Yes, having a lot of options is nice, but decision-making anxiety is a real thing, and easing a new player into your game takes this pressure off of them. Plus, having ships to unlock makes great incentive to try out new modes or get better at the game. Thankfully, I was already familiar with earlier ports of the game, so I had no problem understanding how the game is supposed to be played, but I can imagine new players could get overwhelmed with the amount of stuff you'll just have to figure out on your own. Now, Dariusburst is actually quite different from other games in the series. While you still get to choose your own paths throughout the game, the path that you choose feels less a product of your own exploration and more of a guided tour through the game. Easy, normal, and difficult routes are explicitly spelled out for the player, and a single playthrough will only take you through 3 zones, a far cry from the original games in the series that had 7 stages to play through for a 1cc. However, like I said, it's not about finding the path that works for you. Dariusburst is more about starting from the bottom and making your way through all of the different difficulty levels in order to see all of the different endings. Getting to see all of the endings in previous games was a huge undertaking, since each playthrough lasted so long and a lot of the levels themselves were really tough. Dariusburst makes it much easier to see the entire game through, but the experience overall feels much less personal than it did in previous entries. However, we are given a lot more choice when it comes to control in Dariusburst. Not only are your controls fully customizable, but every ship plays almost entirely different. Dariusburst does a fantastic job at making callbacks to other games in the series. Pretty much any ship you piloted in an old Darius game, you can pilot in this one. The default ships, however, are actually really cool. They have this burst mechanic where you can either shoot a big laser beam out the front or you can pin it to a location in space. By pinning your burst laser, you can actually turn some of the trickier levels into trivial strolls through the park, but you've got to be really careful about your burst laser's energy and its positioning, so it definitely takes some practice getting used to it. You can even counter bosses' attack lasers like you can in G-Darius, but the timing is really strict, and I've only been able to pull it off once or twice. But if that type of control setup doesn't sound appealing to you, you could just play as the ship from Darius Gaiden with black hole bombs, or the Genesis, which is based off of G-Darius and gives you small ships that can be converted into alpha beams, which also makes countering boss lasers much easier. There's even the ship from the original Darius and from Darius 2 if you're really looking for a challenge. There are a couple others as well, but I'll let you experiment and figure out which ones you like best. My personal favorite is the Assault from the mobile port of Dariusburst. Perhaps the biggest change to the Darius meta is the ability to counter certain attack types with your firepower. Your basic gun will nullify any orange shots fired from enemies. Similarly, any yellow shots will be nullified by your ship's laser shot. This means that there's actually some strategy into choosing when you want to upgrade your shot. If you upgrade too early, you might be up against a boss that shoots out a lot of orange bullets that your yellow laser beam will just go right through. But, on the other hand, if you don't upgrade as fast as possible, you might not make it to full power before the end of the game. There's a nice balance between getting as strong as you can as fast as you can, and making individual boss battles easier by having the right weapon power level equipped. This also plays into what ship type you choose, as some ships have the ability to swap between different weapon types, while others get stuck once they've upgraded. Interestingly, death will never drop down your weapon power, so the difficulty of Dariusburst doesn't come from getting stuck with a weak ship when you mess up, but rather from the level design, meaning you just have to be able to shoot down enemies that carry power-ups and master your skills as a pilot. However, because of this, original mode really isn't all that difficult. In fact, if you're just trying to get a 1cc, I'd say it's one of the easiest games in the Darius series. But, like I said, Dariusburst isn't as much about finding your own personalized path through the game, but rather climbing your way through the difficulty levels. So once you've beaten all that original mode has to offer, it's time to move on to original EX mode, which really kicks things into high gear. I mean, just look at this level, it's freaking insane! This is where learning the ins and outs of your ship will become crucial. While you can fly through any of the paths in original mode without really playing around with the mechanics of each of the ships, you will quickly get your ass eaten if you don't learn how to use the burst laser or other secondary abilities each ship offers in original EX mode. Then there are of course Event and Chronicle modes. Event mode is pretty much just a bunch of challenge missions, each of which takes about as long as a normal run-through of original mode, so you could just look at them as bonus paths that you get to play through. These are really challenging, but are a little more forgiving than the later levels in original EX mode. Most of these have no restrictions on them, but there are one or two that require specific ships or a certain number of players. Chronicle mode is where things get really wild. There are essentially thousands of levels, all varying a little bit, scattered around different planets that you have to liberate. When you liberate a territory, it becomes liberated for anyone else in the world that is playing on the same cabinet as you. So for instance, if you go choose cabinet number 4, planet Yabushi, area Gonhogi, you should be able to see that I, Bofner, was the one who liberated this section. A lot of these missions have special restrictions put in place, like only being able to use certain ships or a certain number of players. I particularly enjoyed the missions where you had to pick one of the old school Darius ships to use, and the music of the stages was ripped straight from those old Darius games. Though that isn't to say the original music in Dariusburst is bad by any means. In fact, I think the audio design as a whole for this game is absolutely fantastic. However, I can't quite say the same for the presentation overall. As I said before, the UI for Dariusburst is clunky, but on top of that, a lot of the text is very small, can be difficult to read, and isn't even spaced properly. I mean, look at this, the text just wraps to the next line. And in the 32:9 aspect ratio, it really isn't helping things at all. While the dual monitor option is a really cool feature on PC, we cannot do that on the Switch version, so this makes the entire game scrunched up on the screen. Playing on a TV, this isn't too bad, but playing it in handheld is a nightmare. Just don't do it. And the fact that if you aren't connected to the internet while playing makes the load times go over a minute long makes handheld mode just a freaking mess. In my opinion, they should have just ported the Chronicle Saviors mode from the PC over to Cosmic Revelation, since it already fits the 16:9 aspect ratio. I mean, so do the PSP and mobile versions of this game. I understand they wanted to port the arcade version, but it just doesn't quite work that well on a single monitor. Sure, you do get the option to zoom in to get the full screen experience, but at the expense of half of the game, so that's not even really usable. And with all that extra space that we have above and below the game, it sure would have been nice to have some gadgets like we did in G-Darius HD or every game in the Cozmic Collection, but instead, Dariusburst has none. At all. And unlike G-Darius HD, there isn't any way to watch back replays whatsoever. Why did Taito tease us with replays in the Cozmic Collection only to get rid of them now? Then, just as another little nitpick I have, the storyline and endings aren't tailored to the ship type you're using, so even if you play as a ship without the burst laser, some endings will still say that you use the burst laser in the end to save the day. Look, Dariusburst, another Chronicle EX Plus, certainly is not a bad game, but I can't help but feel like this is kind of a weak port. It plays fine, has no issues with online or slowdown or anything, but to be packaged in a similar way to how the Cozmic Collection was, it makes me expect a little more. Am I wrong to want gadgets when they were supplied for the only other game in this package? Am I wrong to want a port with a proper aspect ratio for the system I'm playing on it when I know that these things already exist in other forms in different ports of the game? I don't think so. If you aren't getting the physical copy of Cosmic Revelation, you actually have the option to get Dariusburst and G-Darius separately, and I cannot in good faith recommend this port, at least in its current state and for anyone with access to any of the other ports of this game. If you can play the PC version, wait for it to go on sale, it happens all the time, scoop that up for $25, and you can have an experience that just feels like more care was put into it. If you don't have any other way of playing this game, then the Switch or PS4 version are certainly playable. They just feel like they weren't put together with the best of care. However, if you're getting the physical copy from Strictly Limited Games, then you'll also be getting Sagaia for the Game Boy as well. Unfortunately, this is the only way to get this game on modern platforms. Funnily enough, there was also an incredibly limited run of the Cozmic Collection in Japan that came with Gameboy Sagaia, and now this version is a limited run but in the West. This also marks the first time this game will be released in the West, so this is actually pretty big news. Now, I'm assuming it'll get its own little game icon as Switch as well, but since I have the Japanese version of Darius Cozmic Revelation, I have no way of knowing how it will play on Switch or even what color palettes will be available. However, I do have an original copy of the game and a Game Boy player for my GameCube, so I can at least let you know what to expect, but I think Pandamonium put it best when he said,
"It's Darius 2, but in slow." For Game Boy collectors, it's actually a pretty solid Darius port, but definitely don't go out of your way to get the strictly limited version just for this port. You can live without it. It's still nice they added this in as a bonus. It's good juxtaposition, really lets us see how far handheld Darius games have progressed over the decades. Don't go out of your way to get this version just for Game Boy Sagaia.
However, if you're still interested or perhaps just curious, Game Boy Sagaia is a watered-down Darius game. Though it shares the same name as the Western release of Darius 2, it plays much more closely to the original Darius and even borrows some of that game's music. The ability to choose your own path through the game is sadly not present, but the bosses look absolutely fantastic for the Game Boy, and the soundtrack is equally as good. Like I mentioned earlier, one of the original tracks even had its melody reused for the end theme in G-Darius. Overall, it'll be a fun bonus for anyone getting the physical version, but like Pandamonium said, don't go out of your way to play it on Switch. And that, my friends, is Darius Cozmic Revelation. So, is it worth it? Well, it's tough to say. If you want the physical copy, then I guess it's probably worth it, especially if you can get the strictly limited games release with Sagaia. But if you're considering buying as a digital download, I highly suggest just sticking with G-Darius HD, and instead, get Dariusburst for another system. There's a standalone PC, PS4, and Vita version that is sold as Dariusburst Chronicle Saviors that I think would be a much better value if you can get it during a sale. I'm Bofner, and thanks for watching. See ya! Okay, Frank Pizza, what are your thoughts on G-Darius?
Big miss not calling this one 3 Darius.